In this lecture, we're going to look at intellectual property. Now, intellectual property is just one kind of property, but property itself is a strange concept. Strange not because it's unusual, in fact it's incredibly common. It's hard to think of anything on this earth that isn't property. It's strange instead because it's kind of hard to get a handle on what exactly property is. When we think of property, we're generally thinking of private property. For instance, you own a ballpoint pen. That is your private property. We think that you can do pretty much whatever you want with your ballpoint pen because it is yours. But there are other kinds of property. For one, there is, in addition to private property, there is also common property. Something is common property if any member of a community might be able to use it. For instance, a public park. We can all go and use the park without getting permission from anyone else to use it. There's also collective property, something that might be owned by a group of people who collectively decide how the property will be used. For instance, the elders of society might decide how to distribute this year's harvest. Or to take a more modern example, our country owns a supply of armored vehicles, and our government decides how they will be used. While some might have thought that our society is based solely on a system of private property, we can see that all three types of property coexist. But for simplicity's sake and for the sake of this lecture, let's just think about private property. One might be tempted to think of private property as a relationship between a person and an object. For instance, saying that you own a bicycle seems to express a relationship between you and that bicycle. But it's really much more than that. It's about other people too. When you own a bicycle, it means that everyone who isn't you has a legal obligation not to take your bicycle without your permission. And so if they take your bike, it is a crime. It is theft, and you can call upon forces, the police, to help you get your bike back and or punish the thief. It's important to realize that you're not paying the police to do this. This is part of what their job is, to protect private property. In other words, you need a public institution, a system of enforceable laws, in order to have private property in the first place. But why have a system of private property? Why not just have communal property or collective property? Here are what I take to be the two main arguments for private property and for an institution of private property. The first is utilitarian. Having a system of private property laws produces a richer and more fruitful society than one that lacks it. This is because a free market economy is better than all the other economic systems, and free market economies require private property. How can you sell something if someone can just take it from you? And why would you buy something if other people can take it without fear of punishment? This is the most common type of argument. And I've outlined the basic thread. I've just outlined only the basic thread in this type of justification. And different theorists, economists, lawyers will all have different explanations for why such a system produces a richer and more fruitful society. But this kind of justification isn't one that necessarily accords with our intuitions about private property. For instance, we don't think the reason others shouldn't take my bike is because they're violating the rules of capitalism, the economic system that happens to have the best consequences. But rather, we sometimes think there's something inherently wrong in taking something that is not yours. This leads us to the historical entitlement theory, which not only tells us why we have a system of private property in the first place, but also tells us why we rightfully own the things that we do. I rightfully own this bike because I bought my bike. But it also needs to be the case that I bought my bike from someone else who rightfully owned the bike. So you own a bike if you got that bike from Alan, and Alan owned the bike. But Alan only owned the bike if Alan got the bike from Beatrice, and Beatrice owned the bike, and Beatrice only owned the bike if, and so on and so on. Now we can see why this might be called the historical entitlement theory. Because whether you rightfully own something or not depends on the history of the object, and that every transfer was legitimate. That every transfer of that object, ultimately to you, was a legitimate transfer of goods. No one stole it. But the question then becomes, well, how do you own something that wasn't owned by anyone before? And for those who defend the historical entitlement theory, the question has many different answers. But the gist is that you put your own effort into something, or to making something from something that wasn't used before, and thereby you own it. Typically, this means taking something out of nature and using it. Let's get back to intellectual property. Now, it's a kind of property, as I said, and usually a kind of private property. There are three main kinds of intellectual property: copyrights, patents, and trademarks. Copyright covers the ownership of an original work. An author may hold, for instance, the copyright to a book that she wrote. Patents cover the inventions of processes and machines, and trademarks covers the use of a logo or the name of a company. Now recall that private property is less about you and more about others. It is about what can be enforced against other people. The same is true with respect to intellectual property. If an author has a copyright to her book, she has the right to distribute, to reproduce, to display, to perform, or to adapt her work, and nobody else is allowed to do this. They can be punished for violating that right. So why do we have a system of intellectual property? What justifies our having such a system? Now, the reasons for intellectual property, because intellectual property is just a kind of property, must be consonant with our reasons for ordinary property law. But there's a substantial difference between having intellectual property and owning a physical object. One of the reasons to enforce laws regarding private property is that if someone broke the law regarding private property, there's less private property. If someone took your bike, or most of your bike, you can no longer ride it. But if somebody copied your music and started performing it publicly, they haven't taken away your ability to hear your music or to play it or to perform it. You're not left with less if somebody steals your intellectual property. The first and more common rationale for having intellectual property law is from a utilitarian concern. The idea is that without a system of laws granting copyrights to artists, writers, and creators, they will have less incentive to make something. They need the capacity to profit from their work. But if their work can be legally and easily reproduced, they won't make money off their reproductions, and so they probably wouldn't make those things in the first place. This is probably the most standard defense for having a system of intellectual property laws. But from a utilitarian perspective, we also want new things to be available eventually for everyone to use so that it can benefit everyone. But for those things to benefit everyone, they must be shared with the public. And so intellectual property laws tend to have time limits. Copyrights used to last 14 years, but now they've been extended to last more than the life of the author. But if you're persuaded by the other private property theory, the historical entitlement theory, then you might give another kind of justification for intellectual property law. It might go something like this. We have a right to the fruits of our labor. We made the stuff, and it is ours. Right? The thing did not exist before, and now it does due to our own efforts. Right? It's just like in making something with respect to a physical object. We come up with the idea. And somebody taking our idea feels like theft, and is theft. For this module, we will look at a number of articles. The first one is by Charles Mann from the Atlantic Monthly, and it's a really interesting article. It talks about the history of intellectual property in the U.S., how computers have made protecting such property difficult, and it explores some of the methods that companies have tried to stop piracy. Now, the article was published in 1998, and it's still relevant, but it has some interesting predictions about ebooks. The second article is Adam Moore's Intellectual Property from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this is a good article that goes over some of the philosophical justifications offered for and against intellectual property, and the merits and problems with those arguments. We will also look at Richard Stallman's classic paper, Why Software Should Not Have Owners. This famous programmer, who's also the founder of the Free Software Foundation, makes the case that, well, software should not have owners. We will also look at John Perry Barlow's article, The Economy of Ideas. Now, this is a classic article from 1994 by one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization dedicated to digital rights. Here, Barlow expresses his skepticism about being able to transform or fix the old intellectual property laws with the emerging reality of the internet and modern technology. Now, lastly, we're going to look at Kirby Ferguson's documentary series or web series, Everything is Remakes. Part 4 is especially relevant for this class, but the whole thing is really interesting.